So Jane, welcome everyone. I am Brooke Warner and I'm going to be your moderator tonight. I do want to encourage you to put your questions into the question or the chat window, whichever, as we go, because at the end we're going to have a fun Q&A time with Jane and she's eager to answer your questions.
Yeah, I love questions.
Yeah, that makes it fun and participatory. So Jane, wonderful to see you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with tonight's event. The title is called Racing Toward Wonder. And I wondered, I was curious, how does wonder play a role in your writing or your writing process?
Well, the type of wonder that I'm used to is, gosh, I wonder what's going to happen next. It's, I view writing and my own writing as a kind of exploration. Maybe a questioning. Sometimes I start out with a plan, but other times I don't start out with a plan. It depends on the project. Usually I start out with an idea, or even just a bit of an idea. And then I do some research, or I look around, or I think about it, or I get some other ideas to add to it. So, the wondering is not about a kind of extraterrestrial experience.
And yet this book,
a day-to-day exploration.
This new book, which I'll hold up so people can see, Perestroika in Paris, is fantastical and wonderful, and has been described in that way, whimsical. So it's not a complete departure for you. I mean, you've done other books that have that kind of flavor, like Moo. So I'm curious, what draws you to unpack wonder in that way, that kind of whimsy.
Well, it depends on the subject, So when I was writing Moo, I think the wonder character you're referring to is the hog,
right?
And that came to me. I was writing the first chapter. It was about a guy who tends to the plantings on the campus, and he sees a boy go into an old abandoned building. And I thought, what's in that building? What's in that building? I thought that. And right. And then the idea came to me of having this hidden experiment of seeing how big a hog could grow if he got to eat as much as he wanted to. And then the hog just charmed me. And I named him Earl Butts after the Secretary of Agriculture during the Nixon years, because he was the one who said, "Get bigger, get out." But then I didn't realize that would be an inspiration. I knew the hog was going to get big, but I didn't know he was going to get out. So
that's great.
So yeah, that's how things work in my mind. Now, in this case, Perestroika is based on my own horse, whose name is Perestroika. She's a thoroughbred. The cover drawing looks quite like her. And I bred her, and she's now 15 years old, but don't tell her I told you that. And she, I really adore her. She's very opinionated, and she's very curious. And I was riding her frequently, and I happened to be in France, and we happened to go over on the west side of the Seine to the Place de Trocadero, and we happened to eat some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful French onion soup. And I was looking around, and I knew where Auteuil was, and I thought, now, wouldn't that be fun if a horse escaped from Auteuil and came into Paris? And I thought, well, it doesn't seem very realistic.
therefore fantasy.
Yeah.
Well, and I read that inspiration, that idea took place like in 2009, so nearly more than a decade ago. Could you talk a little bit about having this idea? Have you been working on this novel for 10 years? And then then also just the fact of it getting published now during COVID, and there's been so much about it being perfect timing as an escape.
I worked on it off and on.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a long time to figure out how to pull it together, but I was working on other projects at the time. I was working on the last 100 Years trilogy.
Right. Small project.
And then I was working on another project that I'm still working on. I'm not sure how to make it come out. But this one I would go back to just for the fun of it. And of course, I had to do a lot of research. That was my excuse. I needed to do more and more research, so I had to go to Paris a lot. And
I'm just wondering about the timing of it being published. Was there any sense that it ought to come out now while people were in lockdown, or was there a conversation about publishing it earlier or later? Because it's just been interesting to see how many people have said it's such a great antidote to these turbulent times, and what a beautiful escape it is.
Well, we decided to publish it about a year and a half ago in the summer. I decided it was finished, and I approached my editor and I said, why don't we do this? And we had no idea that the COVID was going to show up, but we knew that there was going to be a lot of brouhaha about the election. Everybody knew that.
Right.
And so I thought, why not? It can be an escape from all the brouhaha about the upcoming election. And so they agreed to go with it and do that. And they put a wonderful amount of effort into the cover, all the illustrations, the map. They just did a lovely job with it, and I love what they came up with.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The artwork on the inside is a really special touch. I wanted to ask you about writing in the point of view or points of view of animals. It's like both delightful and kind of amazing. I mean, I think that's probably what struck me the most, is how you gave these characters such distinct personalities. And there was just all these moments that tickled me, like there's this part where you talked about, how a dog sees a human as a companion and a horse sees them as a coworker. And I just wanted to ask you about, the depth to which you sink into an animal's point of view and how that works.
Well, I've loved animals my whole life. I started out loving dogs and horses, when I was, 3, 4, 5 years old. And I've always been interested in them. And the books that I grew up with, they gave horses personalities.
Right.
Now, one of the things I learned when I started riding, especially when I got older, was that individual horses are quite different from one another. And if you want to survive and stay on the horse and be a good rider, you have to pay attention to how they are viewing things, how they're reacting to things. Then probably my biggest mistake, but one of my favorite mistakes, was that I started breeding my own horses. And then I started seeing, I had kids of my own by that time, and I started seeing how it was like kids, that the foal would be born with particular idiosyncrasies that maybe the other foals didn't have. I had the first foal I ever had when I was grown up. He loved to stand by the fence and look off into the distance. And I'd not seen a foal do that. Most foals hang out with mom, but he was very very curious about what was going on in the distance and what maybe he was worried about what that was going to happen. But anyway, he was very curious. So I got so interested in how horses were different, how they would think, how they were more complex than maybe we were giving them credit for. And I wanted to understand those complexities. And so it became second nature to me to just attribute thoughts and even words and even ideas to them.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, a lot of people, I think, have that tendency, you know, to see their dog doing something and imagining that they're,
Yeah.
you know, having a human experience. So
A couple of days ago, I was over at the barn and I wanted to give a copy of the book to a friend of mine who was at the barn, but I couldn't I had the horse on the lead rope, Paris on the lead rope, and the cars were too close. So I handed the lead rope to my friend, and I went and got the book. And then I turned around and I showed my friend the book. Well, guess who comes zooming toward the book with her eyes wide open? The horse.
That's very cute.
Just laugh, you know.
And so that's Perestroika.
Yes.
Yes.
So the first thing out of my mouth was, yes, Paris, you're going to be famous.
And so Perestroika is actually her name. And I read some reviews that said, you know, that we're trying to make sense of Perestroika, but of course it's your own horse's name. And so is there any deeper meaning in having named her Perestroika, or?
No, her sire was a horse named Moscow Ballet.
Okay.
And I loved his name. And I thought Perestroika would be a peaceful a name about cooperating.
Okay.
And so that's why I named her Perestroika. But then my trainer, who was a woman trainer who had been raised up in the Berkeley Hills, actually, her maiden name was Paris, Paras. She was from a Greek community. And she just respelled her name to Paris, Paras. So that became her name and the one that we used with her to address her.
I see. Well, I love the character. So it's just interesting. It makes me think, you know, it's kind of funny how people want to attribute deeper meaning to things. And sometimes it's like, well, it's just the horse's name and but you know, spirit of cooperation is a good thing.
Well, let me talk a little bit about Frida, because she was our dog.
Right.
She was our German short hair. And I would look at her. She had particular chair that she liked to sleep in, and I would watch her, and she seemed to have I always used to say she had existential angst, because she would have this look on her face and in her body, and so I started attributing thoughts to her too.
And then she has a big role, missing her human in this book.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about genre, I guess, or category. I mean, it's sort of an interesting and big question that people in publishing love to talk about. And, you know, this is a fantasy. You've said it's a fantasy. Of course, it's not a traditional kind of fantasy. And yet you're this author who, you know, you're a Pulitzer Prize winner. You've written more than 30 books. It's like, when can you just write a novel, right? I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are about our need to micro categorize projects. And do you even think about that, or are you constrained by genre and category in any way?
I usually don't think about it. I mean, I teach writing, so I understand, and I teach literature, so I understand that there are genres. But I'm often impressed by books that are supposed to be just genre books, and yet they're quite well written and interesting. My natural, I don't know, attraction has been to realistic literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up reading Black Beauty, and I grew up reading Agatha Christie, and I grew up reading the Bobbsey twins. So I didn't, and it wasn't until I was a teenager that I was even introduced to literary fiction. So my background was just avid reading of whatever I managed to get out of the library, the public library in St. Louis, the St. Louis County Public Library, to which I owe very much.
That's lovely. Yeah, no, I think so many writers relate to that kind of backstory. So, well, thank you. Thanks for your thoughts on it. I'm curious to know, do you write with readers in mind?
No, I write with, just because I'm curious, and I'm what I always say is, you, the writer, are your own first reader. So you're the person that you have to please first. And then you can hope to find other readers. Now, I will say that about 20 years ago, when I started, almost 25 now, when I started dating my husband, one of the things I liked to do from the beginning was to read aloud to him, because he'd never read any of my work. And so that became a habit. So now when I write something, the next morning, I'll read whatever I wrote the previous day aloud to him. And then I'll correct things that I happen to see. And then he'll ask questions about things that are in it that'll get me to clarify certain things. And I think that what I write, I like better since I've been doing that. Because when you read it aloud, you see things and you hear things in your voice that your eye didn't see when you were just reading over it.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And so, excuse me. Sorry, allergies. When I go back to read books that I wrote early on, I notice repeats or little mistakes that I wouldn't notice in later books, because I didn't have someone to read them aloud to.
Yeah, I've heard people have that experience when they've read their audiobooks. So it's interesting.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. It just, you're very prolific, and you've written all these different kinds of books. And so I wondered if you have this sense of like kind of ticking things off a list, kind of, or if you are more, like now that this is done and you've explored yet another kind of genre and something totally outside of your wheelhouse, is the next thing just whatever occurs to you, or is that how you kind of follow the thread of your inspiration?
Well, I have several things on my table, and I skip around among them. One was inspired when I went to my 50th high school reunion back in St. Louis. And when I came home, I thought, one of the things I love is music. And I've always wanted to learn to play an instrument and to be able to sing, and I've never done that. And I thought, I should write an alternative autobiography of me, as if I had been this other girl who went into music rather than literature. Mm-hmm. So I started that, and I have some of that. And I have a sequel to one of my books that I'm working on. So, I just like to skip around. I like to try new things. And I like to hope that someday they'll get published, or.
And many of them do. You're one of the more prolific writers on the planet, with so many books in process and also so many books published. So how many hours a day do you write?
Probably about 2.
Okay. But pretty consistently.
Yes. 6 days a week, 2 hours a day. I try to get put out, between 1,500 and, probably 1,500 words a day but to do it steadily. I guess in my model for that, in some ways, is Anthony Trollope. Now, he did better than I did. He did 2,000 words a day, no matter what. But I think that doing it steadily like that is really important, because even when you're kind of stuck, if you make yourself put something down on the page, then you might come back to that the next day or the 2 days later and say, oh, that's a good idea. Even if you didn't think it was a very good idea when you first put it on the page.
Right.
So I think slow and steady is good. I like to think of myself as the tortoise, not the hare.
Yeah, well, and it's the opposite of a lot of writers that I talk to who are binge writers and, who can't write in certain environments. I mean, it sounds like you have, can you write anywhere, or do you need to write in a very specific kind of space?
No, I don't need a specific space.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just need my computer, basically.
Right. So back to the book, a lot has been made that nothing bad happens. I think there's just like some expectation. I mean, you teach fiction, so maybe you can let me know. There seems to be an obsession that something bad has to happen. There has to be a villain. There has to be high tension. So was that also part of the challenge of this book? No.
No, that the antagonist in this book is life itself. These are beings who have gone through a lot of problems. And their job is to negotiate the world that they live in, even though they've had moments of grief, moments of loss. So that's fine. That's true of most of us. Most people don't have a villain in their lives. And that's what I like about life itself. I don't want a villain in my life. I don't think there were true villains in the last 100 Years trilogy either. I mean, we followed a family of 2 parents and 5 children and some of their relatives through 100 years. And sometimes they got along well and sometimes they didn't get along well, but I didn't put any villains in there. I'm not interested in villains.
Yeah. Enough is happening in life, and there is a lot of sadness and there is a lot of loss. I mean, it's very relatable in terms of what people are up against. And I think also just kind of the passing of time and so I appreciate that. I wanted to ask you about Paris. I mean, you mentioned that you had to go back to Paris a lot, but you lived in Paris, right?
Okay. No, I never lived in Paris.
Oh, you haven't? Okay. No. Just spent a fair amount of time there.
Maybe I need to set a book in Iceland. No, I never lived in Paris. I wish I could have, but no, I just went back for trips and did my best to explore the best I could. I was invited by my French publisher to come. When was it? I think it was last spring, sometime before the lockdown. And they put me in a hotel over by the Bastille. And I walked from there through the herb garden and through the botanical garden, and then all the way over to the Seine. And it was totally fascinating. And I thought it was a wonderful thing to do.
Was that before or after the Notre Dame burn?
It was after. So I walked past and looked up at the cathedral, and I could see the scars. It was really sad.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me, Paris is one of those cities, and there are other places, probably only comparably Italy and maybe New York, where people love to set novels. And I think it's just that you're captured by the city, but it also strikes me that so many people have been there that there's a familiarity for readers that is really attractive as well.
Well, I love Emile Zola.
Mm.
And some of his books that are set in Paris, I think, are really fascinating. And one of them is set in Passy on the west side of the Seine. It's called A Love Episode. And one of the things that the main female character does a lot is stare out the window across the river at the beauty and strangeness of Paris. And I've always thought that was very alluring.
And so for you, I mean, just one more question about Paris. I know you said you had this moment of inspiration eating the French onion soup, and then you imagined a horse around in Paris and all of that. But Paris is romantic and it's moody and it has this, amazing history. And so I just was wondering, is there anything else about your relationship with Paris that just felt like, oh, I want to immerse myself in this for more periods of time? Do you do that as a novelist, to be like, oh, well, I can live, part-time in my novel in this city?
Yes. I mean, one of my favorite things to do whenever I travel is to walk around the neighborhood where I've been put up or where I'm staying, and to try and kind of expand my circle and just keep looking. And I love doing that. And I will say it's really hard in San Francisco because there's so many hills.
Like enough circles already, I'm done.
It's a lot easier in Paris. But yes, I every time I go there, I enjoy just staring at things. But I also I love French literature. So in my mind, the two are pretty much fused, I have to say.
So there are a lot of writers with us today. I know that there are She Writes authors and others. And, I imagine also a lot of writers come to writing events. And so I just wanted to, because I printed this out, you wrote 13 ways of looking at the novel a few years back, but I recommend everybody take a look at it. And I just saw this one quote, and I wanted to just ask you about it because it speaks to your love of words and your love of ideas, and you're a teacher, so it seems appropriate to get into that a little bit. You say, I always think every word or every new idea is either a firecracker or a pebble. If it's a pebble, then it's just sitting there doing its job of making it progress. But if it's a firecracker, it could be an inspiration. It could send you in a different direction. So I just wanted to ask you to expand on that a little bit more. And, what advice do you have for writers in terms of words and ideas and thinking about pebbles versus firecrackers?
Well, both are essential. And so what you're really doing is just you're moving along word by word towards some place that you don't know. Even if you think you know where you're headed, you don't know where you're headed. Because your plan is really just a map. And you could go off track anytime you want. So what I do is I finish a section or a draft. I set it aside. I try not to ever be judgmental about what it seems like. So I set it aside for some period of time, maybe a month, maybe a few months. And then I come back and I reread it. And I notice things that I wrote that I thought weren't very interesting that turn out to be inspirational, that they have an effect on me and they make me think, oh, maybe that's the direction I should be heading. Now, I will say that some books have been more planned than others. But for example, the last 100 Years trilogy, all I knew was that it was going to start in 1920, and it was going to end in 2019, that the children were going to be born the same years that my mother and her siblings were born, but they weren't going to be like my mother and her siblings. My mother was the one born in 1921, but the first one born in this family is a little boy. And then I knew that I was going to follow them through 100 years of American history. And I knew that they were going to have certain characteristics that were going to sort of shape where they were headed. But I didn't know what that would mean. I didn't know I knew what characteristics they were going to have, but I didn't know how they were going to interact with their environment. And so with each year that passed, I learned more about them. And I gave them more things to think about, and I let them grow up and get old. And it was really quite fun. I really enjoyed it because I felt like at the beginning I was building something, but as time went on, I was just this woman sitting on a train, eavesdropping on these people that were my fellow passengers on the train. And that was the Langdon family. And that's the feeling that you want to have, that
right.
You're being told what's going on, not that you're making up what's going on, even though you are making up what's going on. I know, I know that I'm making up what's going on, but somehow when you get going, then it just comes to you. What's next?
Did you know that it was going
to great pleasure?
Did you know it was going to be a trilogy?
Well, to be very practical, I knew that it was going to be really, really long. And I knew that most people are not interested in a book that weighs 10 pounds.
Right. Or the spine, you crack the spine and it's like, Urgh!
Yeah. So I said, okay, it can be a trilogy. But I said to my editor, I said, I think every book should stop mid-sentence. And she said, no, we're not going to do that. So she made me wrap it up a little bit and make the 3 volumes a little more self-contained than I wanted to.
Do you resent her for making that, for imposing that?
She has a very practical attitude.
I was going to say, thank God for editors. So, well, good. We're getting close to moving into the Q&A with the attendees, but I wanted to ask you just kind of a silly question, like what was the best and the worst thing about writing animals' points of view?
There was no worst thing.
So you'd do it again?
I totally loved it.
Yeah.
I guess my editor she did say to me at one point that Raoul the raven needs to shut up.
Well, he's a very annoying human.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a know-it-all, a scholar. Yeah.
But so I just had one of the characters say, I had him say to himself, maybe I need to shut up. But I loved him all the way through, but I realized that maybe the others, he wasn't quite interesting all the way through. So.
And how about the best, or maybe just juxtapose against writing humans? I mean, did you find it to be similar or?
Yeah, It was similar. What I enjoyed was seeing their perspective on humans.
Right.
And that I found that very amusing to let them voice their opinions about the nature of humans.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing I very much appreciate about you is your sense of humor, and it's even on the page, it's very playful. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So thank you. It's wonderful. Well, good. Jane, I have other questions, should we need them. But I want to see what people are saying and bring Kiski, our voiceover, to start posing some questions.
Okay. Sounds
yes.
good.
Hello. So interestingly, we had a lot of questions asking Jane, what was your favorite book to write and why? And some people who posed this apologize, thinking it might be like asking about a favorite child.
No, the books don't care whether you prefer them or not. So you can actually express yourself on that one. Well, a lot of them were different. So one of the ones that I loved writing was the Greenlanders. And because of the style, which is an archaic style, it took me a while to get into it. But once I got into it, it was like being transported into another world. And it did feel to me like the story was coming to me from afar. And I had never had that experience before, and I loved that experience. When I was writing Moo, I just made myself laugh all the time, I'd write a chapter, or I'd write a section, not a whole chapter. And I'd go out of my office and into where the kids were and where my husband was. And I'd say, listen to this. And I'd read some part that I thought was funny. And they'd look at me and go, huh. But I thought it was funny. So, and that's the first person you have to amuse if you're writing a comic novel. You have to make yourself laugh. And you have to be content if nobody else laughs. Some of the others, when I was writing The All True Travels and Adventures of Lydia Newton, which takes place in Kansas in the 1850s, what I enjoyed about that was finding out about things that I had never known about. I should have known about them. I was from St. Louis. I took American history. I should have known about the Kansas troubles and all of the battles there. And I didn't. And so that was fascinating for what I learned. And I enjoyed the character Lydia a lot. I thought she was she didn't start out, but she became dedicated and self-assured. I liked her. I loved writing Horse Heaven. It was sort of like this book because I got to go to the racetrack a lot. And when I started out my literary career, I wanted to write an epic, a tragedy, a comedy, and a romance. And I knew that The Greenlanders was the epic, Thousand Acres was the tragedy, Moo was the comedy, and Lydia Newton was the romance. Because romance is not really about love, it's about a journey. Originally it was. So when I got to Horse Heaven, I had to portray the horses. And so I decided that the horses, there are 6 horses in there, and I decided that they should epitomize particular literary genres. So there's the epic horse, there's the tragic horse, there's the comic horse, there's the romantic horse, but there's also the realist horse and the fantasy horse. And so I really liked doing that in Horse Heaven. And so all the books have been fun in their way. Some have been more troubling, not in the sense of I didn't like them, but because I couldn't crack the code very well. Some of them I wasn't able to crack the code very quickly. But eventually I felt that I managed to do it.
Thank you. All right. Sheila asks, if this interview had been held 10 years ago, would you have responded the same way as today about genre, pleasing yourself as the primary reader, and so on?
Yeah, I think so. I think I would have. Because if it had been done 10 years ago, I would have already completed 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. And that was a wonderful experience for me, to read those 100 novels, some of which were difficult, some of which were totally fascinating in ways that I hadn't expected because I hadn't read them. And I learned a lot from reading all of those novels. And so I think I would have said the same things.
Cool. That makes sense. Interestingly, since you mentioned 13 Ways of Writing a Novel, sort of in a bite-sized bit, Cheryl asks, what would you recommend to an author setting out to write a first novel?
Well, I think the main thing that you have to do is to keep at it. You have to do enough research in order to know what you're doing to know how to begin before you start. And then you have to be willing to keep on doing the research. And you have to be flexible in order for the research to help shape where you're going. And you have to be willing to do as many drafts as it takes. I always say that the first draft is perfect because it never existed before. But you're still going to have to rewrite it so that other people understand it. And so it's you have to be willing to keep coming back to it until you understand it. Now, I also think it's good to have some kind of advisor, some kind of friend who's willing to read and give you feedback. Maybe someone you can read to, if that person's available. Because what you think you're saying isn't necessarily how people read what you're saying. And so it's good to have a reader or someone who can help you see your own novel from a different point of view. But you want that reader to be analytical, not critical. You don't want the reader to say, "Oh, that's such shit." You want that reader to say, "Oh, okay, so here's what I don't understand." And then to explain to you what they don't understand so that you can see it from their point of view and fix it. You have to be patient. And you also have to be intrigued with whatever it is that you're putting on the page so that you'll keep going.
Jane, to follow up on that part about an analytical friend or reader, a lot of people have beta readers, and I'm curious if you think that there's too many, is there a point at which you should say, okay, I'm only going to show this to 2 or 3 people, or?
Yeah, I would only show, I show the day's work to one person. That is my husband. Usually when I'm finished with the draft, or actually when I feel like this book has gelled okay, then I show it to another friend of mine, and she gives me her opinion. But I wouldn't show it to a whole bunch of people, because then I might be overwhelmed by their responses and not know how to sort of organize what the responses are. When I teach creative writing, the students show their work to a class that has probably 12 students in it, but I don't allow the students to say, well, this is good, or this is bad, or I like this, or I don't like this. I say the students have to say, what I don't understand about this section is why, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. And my usual experience after, a term of doing that is that the students become much more interested in their own work. They don't shut down. They don't want to let it go. They've become more involved in how it gets put together rather than whether it's good or not. And I think that's good for them.
Oh, thank you. That was really great. So Carol has a question bringing us a bit back to the novel. What is it about horses that touch you so deeply? And the same for writing. What do both mean to you at a soul level?
Well, horses are very beautiful. They're very idiosyncratic. And to be on the back of a horse is an incredible pleasure. And that's really all I can say about it. It's been part of my existence since I was 5 years old or 4 years old. And so how I feel about them has just become a part of who I am. And they're never not interesting, So I was riding a horse that I lease on Monday, and we couldn't figure out. He was running, and then he was fine, and then he rolled, and then he was panting, and then he bucked a couple of times, which he never does, and we couldn't figure out what was going on with him. And then today I rode him again, and he was back to being perfectly normal and a sweetie pie from top to bottom. And so my trainer and I discussed what probably was going on with him the other day, and that's just the way it is. You're always thinking that, and generally you're saying, if only they could tell us what they think. If only they could tell us what they feel. But it's an endless source of fascination and complexity. And I think that's what literature is too.
Oh, thank you. So I know you mentioned earlier about using your mom and her siblings' years in the Thousand Acres trilogy. Betsy says she loves 1,000 Acres.
Last 100 years.
Oh, the last. Sorry.
Yeah, not 1,000 Acres. No, that has nothing to do with my family.
Oh, sorry. Well, that actually kind of answers the question. Betsy says, was it asked if it was autobiographical at all?
No. I just, I grew up hearing a lot of stories in my family. And so I became very familiar with the rhythm of 20th century life starting in 1920, because that's what my cousins and my aunts and uncles and my grandparents would talk about. And I thought, okay, the easiest thing to do is just to stick with that rhythm. So 1920 to 2019, because that would mean that I could relate to what was going on in the lives of the characters, rather than making up stuff that I really knew nothing about.
Well, and I want to interject only because the question was asking if 1,000 Acres was autobiographical, and of course, it's famous for being based off of King Lear. And I would love to, it's the first book of yours that I read, actually, and it was a long time ago. I think I mentioned this to you when I met you in person, that I had seen you speak on stage when I was in college. And I have a very vivid memory of that. And so I wanted to just ask you about 1,000 Acres because of the connection to King Lear, and because that was such an ambitious novel and it's the Pulitzer Prize winning. I mean, do you think there's a connection, for having tackled King Lear and what that was? I mean, what do you attribute? I mean, you can't ever say, I guess, what makes someone win a Pulitzer, but what do you think worked so well about that and brought such a huge readership?
Well, my goal when I when I grew up, we read King Lear. When in high school and college and graduate school, we read King Lear many times. And every time we would read it, I would think, how come Goneril and Regan don't get to say what they're thinking? And I always thought they got left behind, sort of. And yet, given how apparently evil they are, they must have some reason. I also, I must say, thought that Lear himself just never shut up. And when I saw productions of King Lear, I never wanted to hear another word out of his mouth, because he was always talking about his worries and his fears and all the bad things that were happening to him. And so everybody said this was Shakespeare's greatest play. It wasn't my favorite at all. But, and I always wanted to, when I first thought of writing that, it was because I wanted the girls to have their say. I wanted to know what they were thinking and why they were doing these things that they were doing. But I also wanted to stick with the things that were happening in the play. I wanted to stick as close to those as I could. I knew there couldn't be a war, but there could be a lawsuit, that sort of thing. So I had to think about the psychology of the family life and the psychology of the girls and why they would be the way they were.
Yeah, and then putting it in the Midwest and giving women voice. So two things. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry again for my own mistake there. This next question comes from Katie, and she asks or says, you mentioned Émile Zola as inspiration. Which other authors have inspired you as a writer? And could you tell us more about reading as a writer?
Well, probably the first author, other than, the woman who wrote the Bobbsey twins or the group who wrote the Bobbsey twins. I grew up reading those kind of books, Nancy Drew, the Bobbsey twins. And then I got to seventh grade, and the books we had to read were very difficult. And I was the girl in the back row when we read Oliver Twist, who raised her hand and said, "But Miss Fieselman, why can't he have another bowl of porridge? I don't understand that." So I scratched my head. I struggled through Oliver Twist, and I struggled through Great Expectations. And then in ninth grade, we were given David Copperfield, and I was terrified of reading it. And then I had to read it. So I sat down and I read it in 2 days, and I totally adored it. And so I would say that those books that I read, or that people read when they're in junior high, are quite influential in their lives. So I love Dickens. I love Jane Austen. I loved horse books, and then I kept moving on. I became very interested I was quite interested in the development of the English language, and I took a lot of ancient language classes. I took Latin in all through high school, and then I took Old English and Middle English in college, and then Old Norse, and I was fascinated by the history of the English language. And so that motivated a lot of the things that I read, and that opened me up to some pretty obscure types of literature. So, yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Brooke, I think I could do one more, if that's all right.
Yeah, why don't we do a final question and then we'll wrap it.
Great. This is a little broad, but Ellen asks, how has the pandemic impacted your writing? I know personally it's impacted all of us in a lot of different ways.
Well, there are books that I'm working on that I really would like to go to where they're set and have a look around. I love to travel. I find going to the setting or the area where the book is set is really informative. And so some of the books that I'm working on, I'm kind of stuck at a particular spot because the Google boy just can't show me enough. I would like to do it on my own. Other than that, I just kind of keep going. And if I get stuck on one project, I'll jump to another one. And thank God for the internet, and thank God for the ability to do research online, and thank God for the Google boy who can walk around neighborhoods that you can't walk around and show you a few things. I can't show you how steep the hills are, though.
He also can't get tired.
No, that's absolutely.
Well, thank you, Jane, so much for joining us. It's been thrilling.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk to you. And I want to remind everybody, if you haven't yet purchased Perestroika in Paris, please visit baybookfest.org/bookstores, and Kiski will put that in the chat window so that you have the link. And also, this allows us to please buy local and indie, or both. We're really encouraging that. We're big on the buy indie hashtag so that we're not supporting Amazon this Christmas season or holiday season, whatever you celebrate. So again, Jane, thank you. And I'm Brooke Warner with She Writes Press and the Bay Area Book Festival Women Lit. And have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you. Yes, everybody have a great night. Bye-bye.